Good morning, and thank you so much for joining me for Daily Spark with Dr. Angela. I am your host, Dr. Angela Butchester. You know what I like to do on my show. I want to enlighten you. I want to inspire you. I want to empower you to become your best self. Now, Scripture reminds us that the tongue is a small thing that makes grand speeches, but a tiny spark can set a great forest on fire. And today, we want to get you fired up about the book, Unraveling the Family History of Jesus. Its author, Steven-Norris. So you know what I'm going to tell you to do next. Go on, get comfy, get cozy, get your coffee or get your tea, because we are about to get started. Good morning, Stephen. Thank you so much for joining me here on Daily Spark with Dr. Angela.
Good morning, Doctor. Thank you for inviting me.
Yes, I'm so glad that you are here. Now, as my listeners already know, we take a little bit of time to introduce our guests to perhaps those one or two people out there that are unfamiliar with you or with your work. So my first question for you is what makes you you?
Well, I grew up in the Middle West and had a normal upbringing, typical Protestant upbringing, as it turns out, but came out here for college. And since I'm in California now, and I've been out here for 52 years, something like that. And so my experience changed completely from being a little Iowa town boy to being a Californian.
I definitely understand that. Now, you kind of touched on that. You went to the School of Theology, Claremont in California. Is being, as far as theology is concerned, or delving deeper into your faith, did you feel that was something that you always wanted to do? Did you feel that call on your life at a young age?
Well, yes and no. When I was 15 back home, I had my first born-again experience. I was converted, believe it or not, in a small little Church of God, Pentecostal church, run by the pastor, happened to be my second cousin. He was an older man, but he was my second cousin. I didn't realize it at the time. Anyway, then I came out here to college, and when I got to college, I ran into some people who were also spirit-filled, and got involved with an Episcopalian church of all things. They had a Friday night prayer group that met, and I started joining that, and I stayed with them for the whole 4 years. In fact, even some after I graduated from Pomona College in Claremont. It was a fascinating experience, and it was there that I received the gift of the Holy Spirit. And then after that, I was originally in mathematics in my major. Then I switched to economics, and finally in my senior year, the beginning of my senior year, I switched to theology, believe it or not, and then went on to the seminary, which is right across the highway, and attended that for 2 years. They offered a doctorate program, but it was a 3-year program, and unfortunately, I had also gotten involved in retail and was getting promoted, and so I kind of dropped it. I had originally thought that I would only be a professor. I never got a calling to be a pastor that I could tell, but I did want to teach. So anyway, I've kept that up and have always been a strong believer.
I love it. I love it. Now, I share a somewhat similar story in that at the age of 16, had a conversation with the pastor of my home church at that time. He's no longer the pastor. He's gone on to do some other things. But it is really and truly a beautiful thing when you kind of know at a young age, hey, I think this is what I want to do. And to come to find out later in life, yep, it's exactly what you were called to do. I love it. I love it. As a pastoral counselor, it is a little different. I think went kind of how you did, in that I want to do these things, don't necessarily want to be a pastor, don't mind preaching the word, but I also want to be able to do these other things. So I agree with you. I agree with you there. Now, being an author, is that something that you felt at a young age that you wanted to do, or did you find that was just the next logical step along your life path?
No, I did not think I was going to be an author at all. In fact, as I said, I got into the retail industry, and then from there I went into, eventually became a real estate appraiser about 30 years ago, which is a job I enjoy. Gives me the freedom to do what I want to do and set my own schedule and so on. But I've kept this strong hobby, which is genealogy. My grandfather was passing away in 1970-71 of cancer, and he wanted me to, he wanted his daughter, my mother, to take us down to see his siblings before he passed. So I went down with her into Kansas and Nebraska, Kansas and Missouri, and I found it was fascinating. I learned all these stories from these great aunts and uncles that I had never met before. And I started writing it all down in the yellow notepad, and before I knew it, I was hooked, and I literally went to my other side of the family, got all the information I could, and then when I came out here, I went to the Los Angeles Library, which has a huge genealogy department, and I even went to a few of the Mormon churches, which have their own genealogy departments, and discovered a tremendous amount of information about my family over literally a period of now 50 years, or 40 years. So in the process of doing that, I accidentally found out that I'm related to the greater family of Jesus, which is what led me to write it all down. My book has nothing to do with me. It only has to do with his family. And I found it fascinating and ended up writing a book about it. So it's my first. I've actually written 2 books, but this is the first one I've published.
What a beautiful, beautiful thing. My listeners have heard me talk about my genealogy journey as well, and just how fascinating history becomes when you realize that you are family with certain people along the way, and it is just amazing. It's like the history jumps up off the page for you. It becomes more 3D, and you want to know that much more, and it really does help you kind of walk down the path to keep going, where before it may have been a little tiring or cumbersome or, just, man, this is becoming its own job. But once you get that information, it gives you the strength to keep going. I love it. I've told everyone, do the Ancestry.com thing or how you're doing and go to the library. You're right. There are so many libraries that have this information. I did the DNA test, which makes it even easier because so many things can just fill in automatically because you have that DNA test there. It is a beautiful thing. I'm so glad that you're sharing this. Now, the title of the book, Unraveling the Family History of Jesus, did you come about that title as you kind of touched on there in finding, in doing your own genealogy?
Well, yes and no. As a Bible student, and of course in theology, I've always been interested in the New Testament, and I found in Matthew and Luke there are those genealogies that are short, but a genealogy in Matthew is largely from Joseph's side of the family, and the other one in Luke is exclusively Mary's side of the family. And none of it made much sense to me because it was just a list of names. And I thought, if these people really existed, then I should be able to prove that by going to the documents that exist outside of the Bible. And luckily, I was able to do that completely, finding out some really interesting surprises as I looked into it further.
Absolutely. Now, did you have any challenges along the way when it came to publishing your book? Were there any hurdles?
Well, financial mainly. I actually published this twice. I published it twice. The first time I published it was with another publisher, and they gave me a Facebook and various attempts to get it marketable. But unfortunately, they were forcing me to charge $44.95 for the hardbound and $26.95 for the paperback, and I just didn't sell very many copies. Then I got a copy. Then I got a call from Penn House Publishers just about a year ago, a little less, and they said they could publish my book for $14.99. So I said, well, it might sell at that. She said, absolutely, it'll sell at that price. And so I re-upped, as it were, and got it republished. It's a much different cover, and we actually added a chapter. It's now 600 pages, when before it was only 440 or something like that. And I'm getting a lot more interest. I have already done one interview with a television station in the South, Kentucky or Tennessee, I can't remember where. And now I'm doing this one with you. I've done a book signing in Phoenix. And this publisher seems to be much more active in terms of getting me exposure, which is what you need if you want to sell a book.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I know that really and truly does make a world of difference. Without giving any names there, I know that I work with 2 agencies that that's part of what they do for the guests that would fit my genre of faith talk radio. That would be, appropriate guests. I have no problems working with them. I love the fact that they're bringing me authors that fit that niche. I know that they need the exposure, and I don't mind sharing them with the world. You're right. When you find the right fit, it is such a beautiful thing, because you see the wheels start to turn much faster. Not that we're knocking the other folks. I'm sure they're good at what they do. They just weren't the perfect fit for you, and I'm glad that you found a better fit for you. Now, when you were putting the book together, not actually writing, but putting everything together, you're now in that process of getting it published. Did you have any happy moments along the way? Like, were you excited for the various stages? Flip side of the coin, how did you feel once you had this newly published, revised version of your book in your hands?
Well, it wasn't so much the revised version, but you talk about good feelings and revelatory feeling that I had. I looked at these 2 genealogies of Jesus, and especially the one in Luke, which is Mary's family. And it just didn't make any sense that I was not able to find anybody in history who matched the names of Mary's ancestors. You have in the history, it says Mary's father was, it doesn't say father. It actually says Mary is of Heli, Heli is of Matat, Matat is of Levi, etc. And some of the Bibles will put in the word son of, and that's incorrect. They were of. This is the unraveling portion of my book, and what made it so fascinating for me. I found out, first of all, that Mary's grandfather, Matat, was actually a man named Antigonus Mattathias II. If you are aware of it, Josephus, Flavius Josephus, was a famous historian of the Jews around the time of Jesus, and he talks about Antigonus Mattathias II as the last king of Judea. Well, it turns out that Antigonus Mattathias II was the great-grandfather of Jesus, and is, in fact, called Matat in the Bible, but he was always called Antigonus by Josephus, and so no one recognized him as actually part of the family of Jesus. Once I was able to discover that, it all started to unravel. It says, for instance, in the book of Matthew, or in the book of Luke, that he was of Levi. Well, it turns out that his father was not Levi. His father was a man named Alexander, the king of Judea. So it didn't make any sense to me. Well, it turns out that I was able to unravel the family history by showing that his wife's father, his wife was Rachel of Arimathea, his wife's father was Levi. And so what happened was that both Matthew and Luke, when they wrote their genealogies, traced the family of Jesus back not just through the men, but also through the fathers of the wives. And this was the trick that was used to keep people like Herod's family from finding out just exactly how he was related to Jesus. As it turns out, Herod's family knew how he was related to Jesus, because in the Temple of Jerusalem they had all of the records of all the families. And those were, of course, destroyed in 68 A.D., unfortunately. But unraveling this, I was able to literally identify as real people all of these names that went back, Matat, Levi, so on, all the way back to Mattathias, another Mattathias from the 100 or so BC. In doing that, it gets more fascinating because once you know that Mattathias II was his great-grandfather, Mattathias had sisters and brothers, and he had another wife. His other wife had children, etc. And it turns out that almost every person in the New Testament of any import at all is related to Jesus. For instance, Nicodemus was Jesus' great uncle. Joseph of Arimathea was Jesus' great uncle. It's just fascinating what I was able to determine, and it's all in my book, of course, and laid out clearly with genealogies and documents. I have over 800 footnotes in the book. I'm a rather scholarly-minded person. I didn't just blow this out of my head. This is actually stuff I discovered by looking at ancient historic documents.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, asking that question again, flip side of the coin, how did you feel when you held your revised version? Because you said you had one that was done with one publishing house. You now have it done with a different publishing house. So this revised version that came out as a new edition, how did you feel holding that copy in your hands? Were you as excited for this version as you were for the original release?
Oh yeah, actually a little more so, because the original version I had it was done with a black background, and I had a chart of the genealogy of Jesus on the front. It was something I had created, and they liked it, and so they printed it. Well, as it turns out, on this new version, there's a really, really pretty cover on it that was created or suggested by my new publisher, and I love it. It's just much more attractive. It sticks out on the shelf like crazy, and should draw a lot of attention. It's a picture of Jesus sitting with a bunch of family members around him, and it really draws your attention. I was quite pleased when I saw the new cover.
Absolutely. The listeners have heard me say, when we have a great publishing company, that's what we pay them the big bucks for. Usually we are pleased when it is done, and big bucks is just there with air quotes. It's whatever package you purchased. But when they do their job well, they really and truly do a great job at that. Well, Stephen, it is time for us to go to break. But before we do, can you remind everyone, please, what is the title of your book? Where can we get a copy? And, of course, how do we stay in contact with you?
The title is Unraveling the Family History of Jesus. It's available on Amazon or through my publisher, Penn House LLC, PENHOUSC. I also have a website on Facebook. You can look under Unraveling the Family History of Jesus, or you can look under my name, Steven-Donald-Norris, and get information about me there and my book.
I love it. Alrighty, everyone. Now you know where you can get a copy of the book. And we are back. Thank you so much for joining me for Daily Spark with Dr. Angela. I'm your host, Dr. Angela Bushchester. My guest today is Steven Norris, and we're talking about his book, Unraveling the Family History of Jesus. I know that is a great title. My next question for you, Stephen, is when you were writing your book, when you were putting it all together, going through the process, did you have a particular audience or a particular reader in mind? Is this for someone who's a little bit more mature in their faith? Is this for someone who's only interested in genealogy? Who's the ideal reader here?
Well, I would not say it's for children. As I said, with 814 footnotes, it's pretty scholarly. But, yeah, it's pretty scholarly. And, of course, it's not a proselytizing book. I don't try to sell Jesus to anyone, although I do discuss some of his teachings in there only to try to identify whether he was a Pharisee or a Sadducee, an Essene, or a Zealot. That's really, as it turns out, important because all of his descendants, that is his cousins, ended up being the people who led to the destruction of Jerusalem some 30 years after the resurrection, 38 years. So in doing this, I think that the person that would love it, it would be, first of all, and anyone who loves history, will absolutely find it fascinating because it's got at least 60 or 70 things in there that have never been discussed before that you can't find in the Bible. Because once I identified his wider family and how they had an impact on later Jewish history right after the resurrection, it gets really, really crazy. Let me give you one really quick example. Thaddeus, who was one of the disciples of Jesus after the resurrection, actually just before the resurrection, went to a little country called Adiabene, which is in Iraq today, and the king of there asked him to come. His name was Monabasus, and because he had a disease, and Thaddeus came and healed him and said that more would be coming. Well, it turns out that after the resurrection, his wife, Helena, became a Christian. Well, she first became a Jew, and then she became a Christian. And she moved to Jerusalem and was one of the wealthiest women in all of Jerusalem. In 39 AD, when Claudius was the emperor, they had a terrible famine. She personally fed the city of Jerusalem out of her own wealth by sending to Egypt for foodstuffs. As it turns out, she was a great aunt, believe it or not, of Jesus. So when you find, and then this is not in the Bible, as you well know, none of this is in the Bible. Well, I found several instances of this in the Bible, or outside of the Bible, and it just makes the story of Jesus' wide family fascinating, to me anyway. I could give you several examples. Let me give you one more. As I said, Nicodemus was his great uncle. Nicodemus in the Talmud is called Nakdaimon. Ben-Gurion was his name. And Gurion was his father, and Gurion was a son of the first wife of Matat, the one I was mentioning was the last king of Judea. Well, turns out Nicodemus was also extremely wealthy. He was one of the three wealthiest, according to the Talmud, one of the three wealthiest men in all of Jerusalem. He had enough food stored away to feed the entire city for 20 years. This is not made up by me. This is in the Talmud. As it turns out, it was destroyed. That food was destroyed during 68 AD, during the destruction of Jerusalem by Titus, the Roman, and believe it or not, destroyed by his own son. It's just a fascinating story. Anybody who loves history will love this book. If you're a believer, you'll also like this book because it really fleshes out, as it were, the writings in the Bible. Once you know more about all these characters, you really get fascinated. Go ahead.
No, I was just agreeing with you that you're so right. I've watched many programs that are on the History Channel where we're talking about archaeologists that have gone to, their goal was to disprove the things that we find in the Bible, but come to find out they actually proved everything that they were setting out to disprove, and how they too said the same thing. If you love history, then it starts to shift on its heels a bit. If you love the religious portion of it, great. If you are a history buff, great. Either way, this is going to appeal to you, and it sounds like your book is very much it knocks on both of those doors for people that enjoy a good read from both aspects. Now, when someone has read it all through, because I know there are a lot of people out there that saying, oh yeah, raising their hand saying, I definitely want to pick up a copy. What do you want them to make sure they take away from having read your book?
Well, I destroy a few myths. I don't know that I'd want them to take it away, but I don't think people should be afraid to find out the truth. As it turns out, Joseph of Nazareth was in fact the son of Jacob. That's in the book of Matthew. And Jacob was the patriarch of Jerusalem. He was a very, very wealthy man. And Jacob's family was extremely wealthy. I'm going to give you all a surprise right now that'll blow your mind. Jacob's children were called Joseph, of course. That was his first. His second was called Ptolas in the Bible, P-T-O-L-A-S. And his third was called Cleopas, C-L-E-O-P-A-S. Well, Cleopas and Ptolas are actually not Hebrew words. They're actually shortened forms of Egyptian names. Ptolus is a short form of Ptolemy, and Cleopas is a short form of Cleopatras. Cleopatras is the male version of Cleopatra. As it turns out, I discovered that Jacob's wife, that's the father of Joseph, father of Joseph, was none other than the young Cleopatra the Great. She was only 19 when she married him, and she married him under the orders of Caesar. It's all in my book. I explain exactly how they ended up meeting. Cleopatra's best friend, as it turns out, was a lady named Alexandra II. She was the Dowager Queen of Judea, the mother of Mattathias that I was telling you about, Mattat. And they became best friends. And her nephew, Jacob, ended up becoming Cleopatra's husband. They had 3 children, as I said, Joseph, Cleopas, and Ptolus. And then their fourth was named, believe it or not, Cleopatra of Jerusalem. So I prove all this in my book, in as much as anyone can prove anything. And it just really expands your knowledge of how strange. You got to understand, these people were all royalty. The family of Jesus came from a royal family. I found no less than 5 cases in which Jews from Judea married into the Egyptian royal family lines. It's all in my book and well documented. You can't prove I'm wrong. Well, you may not be able to say I'm right, but you certainly wouldn't be able to prove I'm wrong because, of course, there are no birth certificates or wedding certificates from those days, but there is a lot of circumstantial evidence. Naming your children, for instance, after your father, Ptolemy, and after yourself, Cleopatra, is pretty amazing coincidence that in the family of Jesus, he would have Cleopas and Ptolus being named when they're in fact Egyptian names. That's just a sample.
No, I think there's probably going to be a lot of people who are nodding their heads there, who have said,
most are saying no way, absolutely no way. I challenge you to read I have a whole chapter that explains exactly how Caesar called this man named Antipater over to get support, and how it all ended up with him being very, very happy and setting up a marriage. And that's the marriage of Jacob. Of course, Cleopatra runs off and has an affair with Caesar, and then has an affair with Mark Antony. We all know about that history. But we didn't know what happened when she was a little 19-year-old girl. Now you do.
Right. I think that most people want to only see Jesus and his family as either at or just a step above the poverty line, because that creates a certain scenario in their head. And I know that I have always said they were not poor. Stop making them a step above homeless. That is not true. People.
I can be more specific. He's called a tekton in Greek. The word is tekton, which is translated as carpenter. Joseph is a carpenter. Well, the word tekton can mean carpenter, but what it really means is craftsman, or a builder of the soul. He was a rabbi. Joseph was trained by one of the most famous rabbis, Hillel the Elder. I have a whole chapter on that, and I show you that his cousin was an Essene, and it was called a tekton. The term tekton was used in the Jewish history to represent a rabbi who is a builder of souls, not a craftsman, not a carpenter, but a highly educated person. And as I said, Joseph had access to a lot of money. He didn't need it, and Jesus, of course, never needed any of it. But Joseph ended up that way. And I also discussed the family of Jesus in the sense that Jesus never married. Jesus never had children. The family, the people who are called the brothers and sisters of Jesus were people that he was raised with, because Joseph's older brother Ptolus died in 6 A.D., and he had a daughter named Anne, who incidentally married the King of England. And the other brother outlived Jesus and had children, and that's where James and John come from, and those were his first cousins. But Jesus was raised in that household because Joseph died. And according to Jewish history, when you die, if you don't have an adult son to take care of the mother, Mary, then that family has to go in with the next brother, which was Cleopas. So it's all explained in my book, and they were treated as brothers and sisters because they all grew up together.
Absolutely, and I'm so glad that you pointed that out. And I know that it's time for us to go to break, and this is a space for people to think that over. But that is so beautiful. When you understand the customs of the culture, it helps explain the little nuances that you may read when you're not from that culture, that you don't quite understand how does all of this happen. So I'm so glad that you touched on that. Now, it is time for us to take our last break, Stephen. But before we do that, can you remind everyone, please, what is the title of your book? Where can we get a copy? And, of course, how do we stay in contact with you?
Again, it's Unraveling the Family History of Jesus by Penhouse. You can get it through Amazon or any of the bigger booksellers. Online, I have a Facebook page. Look, just put in Unraveling the Family. You'll come right up. I have blogs in there that will give you a taste of what's in my book. And I hope that you'll look into it. It's an inexpensive $14.99.
I love it. Alrighty, listeners, now you know where you can get a copy of the book. And we are back. Thank you so much for spending time with me here on Daily Spark with Dr. Angela. As you know, my guest today is Steven-Norris, and we're talking about his book, Unraveling the Family History of Jesus. Now, I love it, Stephen. You left us with a nugget to think about over the break. So my next question to you is, your book already sounds like it is unique from what you've explained to us. However, there's always that person who's the devil's advocate, that says, well, Dr. Angela has authors on her show all the time. Books are books are books. What would you say to the person that says, well, what makes your book so special? What makes it different or unique?
I would say it's the fact that I blow away a lot of myths and I add a tremendous amount of new information that has never been written about in terms of ancient history of Jesus' family. Imagine the family, well, Jesus himself, there are probably hundreds of thousands of books written about Jesus, and yet the things in my book have never been mentioned. And there are at least 50 things in here that will just really blow your mind. I mean, things that you would never have, you say to yourself, why hasn't anybody ever written this before? And you won't be able to put it down. I'm not trying to brag. I'm just saying that it was fun to do. And every time I went to a new site or went to a new historic document, I said, oh my gosh, that's so-and-so. And as it unraveled, it was really fun. I found that Jesus' ancestors were all high priests, kings of Judea, exactly what it says in the Bible, but I put flesh and blood on all these people. I'll give you another example just to titillate you a little more. In the book of Matthew, it says that Jesus was of Jacob and of Mathan. Now, Mathan was a high priest, as it turns out, the father of Jacob. And Mathan was of Eleazar. Well, I found out that Eleazar's real name was Eleazar the Zadok. He was a Zadokite priest, and his father, believe it or not, was none other than Pachora, who was a prince of Parthia. Now, Parthia was a land near Judea, and when you read the history of the Jews, you'll find out that good old Mattathias, the king of Judea, called on the Parthians for help when he was trying to establish himself against Herod the Great. And you find out, well, why? Because he was related to them. It's just amazing when you put it all together, how all of this makes sense. And you find out that Jesus is in a line of many, many different royal families. We have the royalty of Egypt, the royalty of Parthia, and the royalty of Judea, just to name a few. And because of that, he had no need for money. He had plenty of aunts and uncles around him that would support him.
Right.
And it was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun to find it all out. And, of course, to find out that I'm related indirectly, as are almost everybody is indirectly related to the family of Jesus. And I can explain why that is the case. As it turns out, we have the history of Anne. This is the one that I said was the daughter of Ptolus. She married Beli, who was a king of England, and their ancestors become all the royals of England. And if you have done your genealogy, anybody that can get to England finds out that eventually they're related to the royals. And that's what happened to me. There's another way to go. You can go through the family of James, who was a cousin of Jesus. All of those people are come way down and become what's called the Desposni. They wanted to become popes, believe it or not, in the 600s, but the papacy was Roman at that point, and decided they didn't want to let Jesus' family back into it. That's not in my book, but it is another fascinating sideline.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. And you are so right. I like how you take the time to say this is the name that you may be familiar with, but once you know the full name, it helps so very much. Because I think people have always been confused because it's like folks don't have surnames. How do we know, that this James is that James and that John is that John, and how does this all work? And I think that you've answered that question for so many people just from that very generic question that a lot of people have. You're really giving
actually in the history of Josephus, I found that when Josephus introduces a character, he puts his full name and tells the relationship of him. But after that, he only names him by the first name, and it becomes very confusing. You were exactly right. But once if you do it slowly, then you can figure out that this guy that's called, for instance, this guy that's called Antigonus, he's identified as Antigonus Mattathias II only once by Josephus. And after that, he's just called Antigonus. And of course, that's why no one would realize that he was Jesus' great-grandfather.
Right. I love it. I have always been a person that is interested in history. People hear me talk about how much I love family in general, how important family is. So genealogy is close to my heart. So having you on and sharing this subject is just awesome sauce to me. And I'm so glad that you have made the book available for those who have an interest in the various subjects to be able to come together under one book, under one umbrella, and to not only just delve in on the subject or on the side that they enjoy, but to be able to come together as a larger, broader community and be able to be informed. You've just done an awesome job, and I love it. Well, Steven Norris, I have to say thank you again for coming on, for not only sharing about your book, but really and truly just opening the eyes of so many people and for busting a lot of the myths that we have been taught, be it that they were consciously taught or subconsciously taught. So thank you for ripping up some of those myths that we have learned along the way. One last time, if you will, please, can you remind everyone, title of your book, where can we pick up one, and how do we stay in contact?
Again, it's Unraveling the Family History of Jesus by Penhouse Publishing, available through Amazon or any large bookstore. And you can find a lot more about it by looking on Facebook under Unraveling the Family History of Jesus. I have some short blogs in there that'll give you a tantalizing teaser as to what's in the book. And it's $14.99, and I hope everybody reads it and enjoys it.
I love it. Thank you again for being a guest on the show.
You too, dear.
And everyone, thank you for tuning in. I believe that we have enlightened, inspired, and empowered you today. As always, may the Lord continue to shine his face upon you. May you receive his grace and his mercy in all that you do. Until next time, everyone, remember, you are blessed in the Lord. Have a great day, everyone. Bye-bye.